Now we come to the Enlightenment, roughly the 1700s. It's a very important time period in Western culture. We're going to go through it pretty quickly in this course, but there's an awful lot of things going on in the 1700s that are very important in shaping Western culture. It's just that they don't really apply to this course. I'll mention them in passing here, but it's going to go by pretty quickly for us, although a very important time period. One indication of the significance of the Enlightenment in shaping the culture you live in is another name for the Enlightenment. In some contexts, it's called the Age of Reason. That's because, looking backwards at least, Western culture has seen the Enlightenment as the birthplace of modern science. Whether that's actually the best place to see the birthplace of modern science, that's a whole other conversation. But for the most part, Western culture has seen the 1700s as the birthplace of modern science. And I don't need to give you a long lecture about how important modern science has become in Western culture. In a lot of ways, modern science is the dominant religion of Western culture, or at least it acts like a religion. It has that kind of unquestioned authority, a religious type of authority that you can't call into question. For example, what I mean is, like the easiest way, the quickest way to end an argument in Western Europe in, say, the 14th century. The easiest way to end an argument, the quickest way to end an argument would be to say, well, the Pope says, because if the Pope says something, well then, what else are you going to say? I guess we'll talk about something else then. In the same way, you see, the fastest way to end an argument today is to say, well, science is proven, because if science proves something to be true, well then, that's the end of the conversation. Okay. It has that kind of unquestioned authority. You see, what I mean is, it won't end an argument today. If you're arguing with somebody, it won't end an argument today to say, well, the Pope says, because the comeback's going to be, well, who cares what the Pope says? Even among American Roman Catholics, at least there's a conversation to be had, okay? Even if you respect the Pope's position and respect what the Pope says, you can still continue on the conversation. But if you're listening to two people argue and one person says, well, science is proven, you never hear anybody say, well, I don't care what science says. Science is stupid. Science is for stupid people. Science is for people who need a crutch. I don't believe in science. Scientists are stupid. Scientists are just in business for money. They don't believe it themselves. Nobody says that. Okay. Nobody questions the scientific method. Now, you might hear that the scientists haven't done the right kinds of studies, or that they haven't done enough studies, or that their research was biased because of funding from this place or that place or something like that. But nobody questions the scientific method. Nobody says, I don't believe in science. Nobody says that. It has that kind of unquestioned authority. Well, does science deserve that kind of authority? How does it get that kind of authority? Well, that's the kind of thing you would talk about in a history of science class or maybe a philosophy of science class. But it doesn't quite fit into our course here, so we just kind of pass it by. But obviously the development of modern science is kind of a big deal. Another name given to the Enlightenment in other contexts is the Age of Revolution. That's because of a number of political revolutions that move across Western culture at the end of the 1700s. And by now, Western culture spread far beyond Western Europe. But the American Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s, the French Revolution in the 1780s, 1790s, the Latin American revolutions, the 1810s, 1820s, all led by people who read the same books, who had the same starting points in their political philosophies. And obviously these political revolutions have been significant in shaping Western culture. But those we would go into in more detail in an American history course or the world history course. But obviously kind of important. And in terms of these things, they are important. If you're interested in the history of science, that's an interesting topic. Certainly these revolutions are interesting. If you're interested in having a sophisticated conversation about politics, beyond arguing about which candidate you like or don't like, well, the starting point is the political philosophies that come out of the Enlightenment. And if you're interested in those kind of things, I can suggest some reading to you on either of those topics. There's really only one part of the story here that you need to know to understand the story we tell in this course, and that has to do with these political revolutions. One way, and only one way, and not even the most important way, but one way of thinking about these political revolutions, the American, the French, Latin American revolutions, is to see them as a conflict between two groups of people. On the one hand are the aristocrats, the aristocracy. At the start of the 1700s, at the start of the 18th century, they've got complete political power. But they only have political power because they happen to be born into the right family at the right time. Otherwise, they'd just be ordinary people like you and me. But because they happen to be born into the right family at the right time, then they have political power. These are the dukes and the duchesses and the lords and the ladies and the princes and the princesses, and at the top of the stack, the kings and the queens. They've got political power. But there's another group of people in society who have a different type of power, and that's a growing middle class, which has an awful lot of economic power. I think, and I'm serious about this, that the United States is the only place in the world where teachers have to explain to students what middle class means. Because in America, we don't have a class structure. We don't have a class system. We haven't had one for a long time, at least, and when we did have one, it was very simple. Americans use the language of class, but we don't have a class structure to go along with it. And most Americans consider themselves middle class. Every poll has a little different result, but by far most Americans consider themselves middle class because Americans tend to think that class has something to do with how much money you have. And upper class means you have a lot of money, and lower class means you don't have much money. And since everybody in America knows somebody who has more money than they do and somebody who has less money than they do, they think of themselves as middle class. That's why politicians running for office always have to mention they've had to promise something for the middle class. Because everybody says, hey, that's me. I'm middle class. You might want to go on the candidate's website and read the proposals and see who they really think are middle class, because that might surprise you. It might not be you at all. But we like things to be promised for the middle class because everybody says, that's me. The class really doesn't have much to do with money at all. First of all, there's a difference between wealth and money. That's a whole other conversation. The Windsor family, Queen Elizabeth in England, is a very wealthy woman, but she doesn't have much money. I think it was 2 years ago she had to go on a welfare program to pay the electric bill at Windsor Palace. Not a lot of money. She's got a lot of wealth. She has the crown. She owns the crown jewels of the United Kingdom. Like she can go and take that to the pawn shop. So it's not really worth anything. Anyway, class has little to do with money. Okay, you can go, let's say, to England and meet someone who's lower class who invented a software program and has $2 million in the bank, and they're lower class. Or you can meet somebody who lives in a cardboard box behind a grocery store, and they're upper class, and everybody knows when he walks down the street that he's an upper class bum. It doesn't have much to do with how much money you have. It's hard for people who don't grow up within a class system to understand. But anyway, for the 1700s, in the context of Western culture in the 1700s, by middle class, what we mean are people who own their own business. This business may be making an awful lot of money. It may be going bankrupt next week. The point isn't how much money is coming in. The point is that these people have control over their lives. What time do they go to work? Whatever time they want to go to work. They own the business. It's their business. What time do they go home? Whatever they want to. It's their business. How much money do they take out of the cash register at the end of the day for their family? Whatever they want to. It's their business. Now they may be making those decisions wisely. They may be making those decisions foolishly. But the point is they've got control over that part of their life. This is the baker and the butcher and the candlestick maker and the guy who owns the butcher shop in town and the candle maker, the fish shop. People who own businesses. They may be very wealthy businesses, may be very poor businesses, but they control that part of their lives. They don't work for somebody else. That would be working class. They don't, at least theoretically, work for everybody like the aristocrats do, theoretically at least, because they run the government. But they work for themselves. They control their own lives in that sense. And what you see happening in the latter part of the 1700s is the middle class is reading the newspapers, reading what a mess the aristocracy's made out of things, and the middle class are saying, well, maybe somebody like me ought to be running the government. Maybe somebody who's had a job before. Maybe somebody who's had to work with a budget. Maybe somebody who's had to make hard decisions about how to hire people and fire people. Maybe somebody like me ought to be running the government. And we see the aristocracy and the middle class coming into a conflict over power. And the economic power of the middle class trumps the political power of the aristocracy. And in the United States and in France and in Latin America, we see the middle class overthrowing the aristocracy. That's just a part of the story of these political revolutions. It's not even the most important part of the story, but it is the part of the story you need to know to make sense out of the stuff we're going to be looking at that comes out of the Enlightenment. Because there's two competing movements going on at the same time, and we're going to be exploring those in the next session.